Welcome to The Happy Writer, a show about creating and sustaining a long-term author career. My name is Patty Jansen, writer of science fiction and fantasy. I've published independently since 2011. This show covers motivation, diversification, learning new skills, and your place in your career. Come on in and be happy. In episode 46 of The Happy Writer, I'm going to be talking about my writing process. This is a very big topic and will probably cover several episodes. At this point, I'll probably just start with the process of how I form ideas into complete stories, because this is something I often see beginning writers struggling with. As most of you will probably know, I write science fiction and fantasy, and I alternate between the two genres. My science fiction tends to be more on the realistic side, and my fantasy tends to be on the dark side, although I have just started a more light-hearted series. I will talk about how I formed the worlds of these series and how I use the ideas for individual books. Readers will often ask you the question, where do you get your ideas? To be honest, I think it's a bit of a silly question, because how can you not have ideas? Are there really any people out there who don't have ideas? Of course, story ideas don't usually spring fully formed into your mind. They're usually little snippets. They could be about a fact, a setting, a character, or a situation. I have an ideas file in Scrivener. Each of the ideas occupies a subfolder, and sometimes when I'm really keen, there is a very rudimentary plot outline, and if I'm really keen, I might dictate a chapter or two into this file. Invariably, though, I find that the idea is not ready yet and I don't have enough material to form a story. But how do I know what makes a story? This is something that you gain through experience. As a guideline, it's my belief that one idea, not even a strong one, can make a complete story. You always need something to interact with the idea, a second idea. It could be about the characters or something about the setting. For an idea to make the next step into an actual story, there has to be an overarching plot that holds enough mystery and interesting ideas for scenes. Ideas are not scenes. An idea is often about why something happens. Scenes are about what happens, a word-for-word description of the characters going through the motions. Without scenes and the stuff that goes in them, there is no story. Even more, most of the time the stuff that happens is kind of independent of the purpose of the scene, or a scene could have more than one purpose. The scene itself consists of characters doing stuff that fills up the bulk of the word count. Then there is the why this happens that can take up as little as a few lines. So those are the two levels of my planning. I might have an idea that says, wouldn't it be cool to have a scene that is set in a certain place, or a certain type of place, or a certain type of scene? For example, if the cool scene idea is that I want my characters to meet a pterosaur, and I can make a decent description of how and where this happens, I can make the pterosaur a captive animal, or I can have a charge out of the bushes. This stuff, the character's amazement, the fear, the running and hiding, would take up the bulk of the scene, but I can quite easily swap out the characters, and I can even more easily move this scene to another part of the story or change the reason why the characters meet a pterosaur. To start writing successfully, I initially only need to know what scene types I need. I can write a draft of a pterosaur scene without knowing who is going to be in it or why. But the end product will require what happens and who is there and why does it happen. Of course, those things need to be added. But I can't start writing at all without the scenes. So I need cool scene ideas. To get ideas for cool scenes, I tend to look at the real world, and especially at the slightly more outlandish things that are not particularly mainstream. This could mean a futuristic world where everybody walks in the street wearing augmented reality goggles. What would it mean if you didn't have them? What would it mean if they weren't working and no one was helping you make them work? And what would it mean if you couldn't afford it? What would it mean if you came from a different world and you didn't know how to access the system? Those are all small ideas about a situation that by themselves don't justify an entire story. Running with the idea of the augmented reality goggles that our main character doesn't have, there needs to be a consequence for not having them. Because he didn't have them, he couldn't see something, or because he didn't have them, he could see something. I have, in fact, used this very thing to start off one of my major series. It's not about goggles, but it is about different abilities. My main character, Corey Wilson, in the Ambassador series is very much human at the beginning of the series, and because of this, he has the ability to see the color red, and most of the alien people do not. So this is why he can see something that they can't, and realize something that they don't know is happening. That by itself does not make enough material for a story. It's an idea, but it needs more. Until I know what else it needs, I write all those little ideas into my Scrivener file, and often borrow from it later. You will find that some of the ideas are bigger, and they will absorb other ideas to become a more coherent story. I regularly cannibalize failed stories which I started to write in the past and then just couldn't figure out how to get the story to work. For example, the 4th chapter of the Sahara Conspiracy, which is Ambassador Book 1A, starts with "White powder in a plastic bag spells trouble, especially when slapped onto the counter of a dingy shop in Djibouti by a man missing his 2 front teeth." That whole section of the chapter, and most of the chapters that followed, are copied almost word for word, with character names changed, from a short story that I started to write years earlier and I just couldn't get to work. What was the problem with the short story? Well, the setting was very nice and evocative, but there wasn't a strong enough overarching plot. So when this Ambassador book came along and I had to write something about a warlord having ensconced himself somewhere in that particular part of the world, the 2 ideas came together. Ideas that make a full story consist of ideas about cool scenes, because you need something visual and something to happen, or something to describe, and ideas about what drives those things. Especially in the past, I would start off with something that was really cool and then realize that I needed to find some motivations as to why all this was happening, who was behind it, what they wanted, and where the story needed to go. Scenes and motivation. These are different layers in the story, and you need all of them for the story to work. If you just have character banter but the plot is weak, the story is probably not going to be hugely successful. But if you only have a cool plot and the setting is lacking, it's probably also not going to be hugely successful. And if your characters don't interact with the plot, you could have the coolest fantasy world, but if all the characters just talk about their very human hang-ups and relationship difficulties unrelated to the setting, then you're missing an opportunity. A good story is where plot, character, and scenes all interact with each other. I don't start writing until I have at least some sort of an idea of how I will do this. I will have a few key scenes mapped out. Occasionally, one single scene is strong enough to carry the whole book. At the beginning of my writing career, I was making some notes about a character I wanted to send to an alien world. I love science fiction and especially love it when it is space-based, but in most cases I feel science fiction writers have missed an opportunity by taking the setting far away from the current world so that they can never comment on what the future Earth will look like. In those books, Earth has either been lost or so far away that people have forgotten about it. That is one aspect of the canon of space-based science fiction, especially space opera. I like to keep Earth in the picture, so this was the basis for a story I wanted to write. It was to be about an ambassador, someone who would straddle the different types of worlds, one of which is an alternate future version of our Earth. But when I first started making notes, I was kind of bored, and I was writing a chapter about somebody starting a job. I wasn't particularly engaged with it at the moment, I just wanted to make some notes. So here was my character and the president talking, and then all of a sudden there is an explosion and all kinds of bad things start to happen. At that particular time, I had no idea where this explosion came from. I hadn't planned it, and my mind just threw it in there. I had to write until the end of the book to find out who actually did it. In fact, I wrote the entire first draft without having a clue who did it. True to what I just said here, this first draft was all about the scenes, about what happens, about people reacting to a threat, even if just at that point I didn't actually know what the threat was or where it was coming from. That one explosion carried the whole story, but this sort of thing is rare. Usually I have a few turning points of when I need something to happen. Those things all go into the ideas file. I start writing when I feel that I have enough material that I can hang the story on without leading myself up the garden path or getting stuck without a clue how to proceed. At the beginning of my writing career, I wrote a lot of short stories because I was trying to get them published by magazines. I got some published in what the market calls pro magazines, ones that pay more than 5 cents a word. But other than the still rather paltry payment, I found the exercise of writing short stories hugely beneficial. If you tell a very simple story and you strip away a lot of the complicated rabbit holes that your mind is likely to wander into, you're left with a simple, linear plot that you can expand. It is much easier to expand something than it is to take stuff away. So if you're having trouble keeping an overview of a story and writing it successfully to the end, I would advocate that you start with something really simple and short. Start with one simple, linear main plot. Use characters to drive the plot, but only to the extent where they serve the plot. Short stories will have character detail, but in small doses. Just start off telling the main story and leave all extraneous stuff to the side. Later, you could expand information about character relationships and their motivations, but a short story will concentrate just on the plot. One single idea that has a start, finish, and end. 4 scenes. 1,500 words per scene. 6,000 words. You can complete this in a week or 2 if your life is really busy. Don't worry about publishing at this stage. Grab the next idea. Open a news website or a physical newspaper, but seriously, who still reads those? Pick a topic that sounds cool. Think about a character that would interact with this topic. Then plot out your 4 scenes. Beginning, inciting incident, complication, character fighting back, and resolution. Write it. Then take the next topic. Rinse and repeat. Practice. Like a musician. I have repurposed a lot of the short stories in the beginning of my writing career, especially those I couldn't get to work, but sometimes also stories that did work and I sold. The section in Shifting Reality, where the construct artificial human, Jas Grimshaw, mind travels to deliver a lecture at Ganymede University, is a complete short story that I sold to an anthology. I changed the ending a little bit, but that's all. I also wrote a short story about an outbreak of an alien disease in a space station orbiting Earth. It was meant to be horror science fiction. I sold the story, but after they accepted it, the anthology never happened, so they gave me my story back. I don't usually like horror, so I changed the ending and I did some character stuff, And that story, no longer classifiable as horror, is now the novella Contamination in the Jonathan Bartel series. I also wrote a short novel to sell to a traditional press about an unreliable character who is an artificial human who has had his mind messed with. I never submitted it because I couldn't get the ending to work. That was until I joined it with another idea from one of my existing series and gave the man a secret that he was not allowed to remember. Other than that it's a story about the secret, and there are actually several secrets, it is also a story about the complexity of human biology and the imperfect results of medical science. You know how they say that a medical treatment or prevention works in 99.9% of the people? This is the story about the 0.1%. That story is now the novel Juno Rising in the ISF Allian world. This has turned out to be one of my personal favorite books. All this is just to illustrate that when you've got an idea and it doesn't quite work, don't despair. Words are cheap, and especially if you're like me and you dictate them while on a walk, put it aside and an additional idea will come. Keep an ideas file and write little notes of things you would like to include in a story one day. But every now and then open the file and go through it to see if you can combine 2 or more ideas to either start a completely new story or to solve a problem in a book you're currently writing. So, this is my bit about where do I get my ideas. The ideas are formed over a period of time, and they are continuously added to with facts from real life or situations I can see play out as a result of something I've seen or read. And the ideas themselves, where do they come from? I read a lot of non-fiction. I love newspapers. I read the news all the time, especially background articles, and I save stuff for later use. I listen to a lot of political podcasts for inspiration about characters and about plots and evil schemes, and I use Google Maps and Google Earth quite a lot. Even my fantasy is often based in reality. I may change the names of the herbs or treatment, but most of my plots have some base in reality. Thank you for listening. In the next episode, I'm going back to marketing and talk about drip ads, what they are, and how you can use them. Thank you for listening to the Happy Writer Show. Check out links and information about other episodes on my website at pattyjansen.com, where you can also find out about my books. You can support me by subscribing to the show or on Patreon at patreon.com/pattyjansen.